Hello, and welcome to the Enterprise Automation Excellence Podcast, hosted by Enterprise Management Associates. As a leading IT analyst firm, we provide deep insights across IT and data management technologies. In this podcast, we explore how automation drives business processes, analytics, development, and infrastructure. Join hosts Dan Twing and Tom O'Rourke as they discuss the evolving automation landscape, share strategies to optimize your tools, and guide strategic decisions for your automation portfolio. Now, let's dive into the world of automation excellence.
Hello, and welcome to the Enterprise Automation Excellence Podcast. I'm Dan Twing, and I'm here with my co-host Tom O'Rourke. And today we have our first guest, Chris Steffen, who works with me at EMA and appears on his podcast, the Cybersecurity Awesomeness Podcast, which we've referenced on past episodes. Welcome, Chris.
Well, hello. Thanks for having me. I'm Chris Steffen. I am the Vice President of Research at EMA. I'm also the co-chair of the Zero Trust Working Group for the Cloud Security Alliance. I'm an all-around security nerd, have been for the better part of 20 years, and have had lots of experience as a practitioner and as an executive in the security space. So really happy to be here and look forward to having our conversation today.
Welcome, Chris. As Dan and I have been getting rolling with topics related to automation, we've touched on security a couple of times. We referenced one of your earlier shows when we were talking about why CrowdStrike should be relevant to our automation audience. And I think, for today, the way we would like to start this is to get some guidance from you on how automation teams should work with their security teams. In general, enterprise automation provides some challenges from a security perspective. They're running business critical processes. They're highly integrated into the environment. The dependencies are sometimes fragile, using legacy software, difficult to update quickly. They have limited downtime windows, but at the bottom line, automation software is often a potential attack point. So where would you start in how automation teams should look at this and how they should be working with and taking advantage of the knowledge of their local security team?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and it is complicated, but it doesn't have to be complicated either. The first thing that I would logically do is when you're taking and having these conversations, understand exactly where you're coming from. So, for example, any hypothetical situation always needs to be evaluated, and that's just taking and doing some kind of risk assessment. Understanding how a tool takes and either mitigates or creates risk in an environment is always a great place to start. Case in point, you were talking about CrowdStrike. Again, nothing bad on CrowdStrike. I mean, they do a great job as a security organization, but this is a case where I would assume that most people in their environments have not truly evaluated the risk that an automated updating tool has on their production environment. And had they really effectively updated and understood that risk, they would understand that had that tool done something weird being a technical term, that's the kind of outage that they were going to potentially having. If you did properly evaluate that risk, or you're a graybeard like me, there's a chance that you probably didn't allow the update to happen in a production environment first to begin with. You did so in some kind of staging environment, some kind of testing, QA environment, whatever have you. And then you would immediately found out that, yes, this breaks the universe. And once you figured out that it breaks the universe, you decide not to deploy that update into production. That's the old school methodology. You're talking to somebody who built or tried to build 5 nines data centers in his life. And so the idea of having something in my environment that was completely invisible to me outside of my control, but having that kind of impact on my production uptime was a non-starter. So we did that kind of evaluation from the very get-go. We had change control boards. We really had a very firm understanding of what was going in and out of our production environment. That was the old school way. Now we have, these scrums that, immediately deploy 12 times a day through whatever environment. You have some kind of automated testing tool. And I think we've lost sight of taking and having a better understanding of what the impact of some of these newer technologies are, what the impact on some of these updated processes are. And I'm not saying we need to regress. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is having an understanding of what the potential impact is I think is absolutely important, of understanding what's going to happen in my production environment. If you don't know, then you certainly can't plan for it, and you certainly can't evaluate the risk.
I think that's very fair. I think there has been a push to rely more on SaaS tools, rely on the vendor rather than building up that knowledge and those skills in house. And that can be a real challenge.
Yeah, I'll share a story with you. When I was at the Black Hat conference, in fact, this story's actually been published in other places too. But when I was at the Black Hat conference, and not going to name any names, but a young person came up to me, a reporter, and I was talking about environments in general. In fact, we were actually talking about this outage in particular. And I mentioned specifically that it would have never have happened to me, because when I was taking and in charge of data center environments, I was striving to have a 5 nines data center. And that person looked at me very confused, because they had no clue what a 5 nines data center is, or what that term actually even meant. Okay, that's okay. I explained it to them, but the current generation, and again, aging myself with my gray beard here, is so out of touch with infrastructure considerations and concerns that they don't understand the need to try to have that kind of fault tolerant infrastructure that would have been created by a 5 nines environment. It's not because they don't care. It's because that's somebody else's problem. To quote our good friend Douglas Adams, it's SEP, someone else's problem. And so you look at a cloud environment, you look at some of the SaaS architecture that's out there today, and they just say, well, it's either up or it's down. If it's up, it's great. If it's down, then we call the person who's supposed to have it up, and then we live happily ever after. But they don't think about what it takes to have that environment up and running. Again, part of this is old graybeard kind of walking uphill in the snow both ways kind of things, and I understand that. But at the same time, it's a real problem. Somewhere in the mix, we've lost some of that tribal knowledge that makes it really important to understand fault tolerant infrastructure and why those things are important to a production environment.
Yes. And do you think that the principles that are driving a lot of the efforts in security right now have been lost as well?
I think that security people in general, and me in particular, are a lot more skittish and concerned about those things than the average bear. Have we lost them completely? We haven't. I mean, people understand fundamentally what it is, and there are people that are running on-premise environments today, and they understand the value of those things. The key is that from an operational standpoint, I think that our lockstep brethren in IT ops and just regular ops, I think we have forgotten some of those things to a degree, because they're just not as relevant today as they were, again, when I was running my own environment. I promise you that my executive team, the IT team, we all knew exactly when the data center was up or down or sideways or whatever have you. And today, it's a cloud instance that we pay attention to, but when it's up, everything is fine, and I don't think anything more of it. When it's down, then it's a disaster, and you deal with it accordingly. But I think we've lost some of it, but I think that there's a lot of it still there.
Since we're targeting this for automation teams, what should they be doing here to make sure that not only are they understanding their risks from a fault tolerance perspective, but they understand the security landscape that they are smack in the middle of?
Yeah, I think, I know this sounds very, very basic, but communicate with your team, right? They need to understand what kind of credentials you need, what kind of permissions you need, what kind of access you need, why you need it. Does it need to be all the time? That's one that kills everybody. We determined that, well, this database account needs to have admin credentials 100% of the time in order to exist. And that's almost universally never the case, right? It's one of those things where it needs it when it logs on or does this particular task or does this, that, or the other thing every once in a blue moon. And the rest of the time, that account can either be, disabled, or the access can be truncated or whatever have you. Understand and communicate your needs, those requirements to the security team, and break down the walls between those silos so that they can, effectively try to help you. The great news is that despite there being this idea that the security team is the team of no, they are interested in trying to help you. And the great news also is that in the last couple of years, you're seeing that the security team has a true business case and a business leader that can actually take and move things forward and might be able to help your automation teams get some of their goals accomplished as well. So again, that communication I think is critically important. Be specific, make certain that they know what you need. And then all of a sudden you have a champion within the security team that's going to be wanting to be able to help you when you have other concerns, when you have other needs, to kind of figure out what some of those things will be and how they can help.
Chris, that's great advice when you're running an automation team and you're in control of the automations that your team is defining and putting forward. What we're seeing in the automation space as tools are being expanded and the concept of enable people to define their own automations, the citizen developer, that adds a whole new wrinkle to trying to teach people best practices. We know how difficult that is in just getting people not to respond to phishing and spear phishing attacks in their email. Now we're going to let them define automations. What are your thoughts on how we learn how to govern such a widespread use of automation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real problem, right? And understanding, exactly what an automation does and how it's going to impact your environment is all part of that risk assessment that I was talking about. You really should not be automatically trusting anything and everything that you download off of the internet. It's trust but verify, right? And so understanding what it does, how it impacts your environment, how it can be configured to have less of an impact on your environment. And maybe it's just something as simple as changing a configuration or changing a permission or whatever have you. Those are critically important. Now, it isn't to say not to use them either. That's actually not at all what I am saying. I am saying understand what the impacts are going to be from taking and utilizing a third party to help you with an automation script or whatever have you. And then from there, you can make an intelligent decision. Is that a risk that I'm willing to accept? Or is that something that maybe there's a different solution, one that is less risky, one that provides greater comfort to our risk managers, our management, and determine what to do from there. I can tell you, if you take and download something from the internet and deploy it into production without really checking what's going on, you probably don't have a risk manager or an executive in your building, when you phrase it that way, that's going to be happy with that situation. I know as an executive, I would not have been. So taking and making certain that you have crossed those T's, dotted those I's, I think is critically important. Not to say not to use it, but trust but verify is critically important.
I would agree. I think in general that automation teams who are working with citizen developers are challenged in figuring out the right level of change control, because often the citizen developers have been tattooed with the word agile, and any control is regarded as something that is only going to slow them down and reduce value for the customer.
I've heard that conversation before too, right? And I am of the camp that agile doesn't always mean better. I would always claim that quality and security and stability is better than having a non-secure, non-stable environment. So I understand the need to get development done fast, taking and using third parties to take and help you with that, be it citizen developers, be it existing scripts, being existing shareware, freeware tools, whatever have you. Again, I'm not saying don't. I'm saying if you don't do an impact analysis of determining what that's actually going to do to your system, and you kind of almost haphazardly deploy, it might work, but it also might not. And that it's not something that I've ever been willing to, in every role that I've had. I always want to know. I'm not really, I guess I'm very risk adverse. And so I want to understand exactly what that impact is going to be. And I think very realistically, if you describe it to an executive, they understand that you want to get it out the door. They want to get it out the door too, for a myriad of reasons, cost and whatever have you. But if you also told them that, well, I can get it out the door, but there's a 50% chance that it's going to break something, then they're going to say, please don't do that. I mean, that is the definition of insanity, right? You would never do that. And there isn't a developer that I know that wants to create bad code. But sometimes we're forced to take and create code in such a rapid way that we don't have time to test it. We don't have time to evaluate it accordingly. And I think that it's a hard conversation to have. It's a conversation that, again, I think a lot of more companies should have, but it's a conversation that's rough. But having that conversation and being very honest and forthright, I think only makes your business stronger when it's all said and done. When you don't have the ability to have that kind of conversation, then these are the kind of events that can happen. And it can be crushing. It could literally be the end of a business depending on the impacts that it's going to have.
Chris, you alluded to the turn on the access or the privilege when needed. We've seen a lot more use of dynamic privilege access management and centralized identity and access management systems. And a lot of these tools, including the automation tools, if they haven't already, many more are looking to draw their permission basis for a given user, for example, from those more centralized systems. Do you think that that's a good practice that should be considered more when we're talking about citizen developers and so on?
I do, very simply because some control is better than no control, right? So understand the infrastructure that you have, understand what you have that you can use for authentication and identity within an environment, and use that. Is it going to be 100%? It won't. And that's just understood. You want to be able to take and do your best effort with causing the least amount of friction. But if you already have a solution, a procedure, a process in place that does an adequate job of rights management, identity management, then start there. If you find out that that happens to not be enough, depending on whatever considerations you go through, then you can talk about the next thing. But again, start with what you have, then figure, and again, do the analysis based on what you have, figure out if that is quote unquote good enough for your environment, for your particular workload. If it is, then good, you're solid. If it's not, well, then you can figure out what you can do to mitigate that control gap, right? So it could be that you're going to buy a secondary tool. It could be that you have to tweak the settings on an existing tool. It could be that you have some other kind of compensating controls that'll solve that problem for you too. And I don't know, every environment's obviously different, but any one of those things is a possibility. But again, you sure don't know if any of those are a possibility until you give it a shot. And so give it a shot, find out if it does what you need it to do. If it doesn't, then you can take the next steps in figuring out what you're going to do. But the worst security projects in the world are the ones that never get started to begin with. So figuring that out, getting something on the books as starting, seeing if that's going to do what you need to do. If it doesn't, then you evaluate from there. That's what I would always recommend.
I think we've covered some good ground here. What resources would you suggest that an automation team start with to get a better understanding of the key issues that they need to be thinking about and where they should be looking for help from their security team?
Yeah, the first one's the easiest one, right? And that is you have an internal security team, guy, girl, talk to them. Go to lunch. Have a stake on the company and spend an hour or two talking about, here are what my concerns are, here's what we can do. They likely already have guidance that they would want you to follow. So start there. Start with your internal team, start with the documentation. If you're starting out completely greenfield, look at the SANS Institute. You can take a look at The government, depending on if you have that kind of need for that kind of security, the government has a gazillions of documents. The whole 800 series is based on various security constructs that will make your company a better, more mature, security aware company. You can certainly start there. And then you can always phone a friend. If none of those things work, take and either talk to a vendor. If all else fails, you always are welcome to ping me on LinkedIn. I can take and point you in the direction of a vendor or a solution or a document that can kind of send you in the right direction. But the community is big. The community is good. Likely, and I've never ever met the security guy that if you say, can you give me 5 minutes to answer a simple question on how to make my company just a little bit more secure, every single one of them that I've ever talked to will take that 5 minutes to help you. We're again, most of the security guys that I know, they're truly dedicated and interested in improving people's security. They're not out to make a gazillion dollars. They're not out to take over the world. They're out because they're passionate about security in general. So this is one of those cases where you phone a friend, that friend can either be internal or external, and take it from there and figure out where you're going to go. And like I said, if all of that fails, let me know, and then I will find a friend for you to talk to if it isn't me.
Fantastic. Dan, any final questions or thoughts?
Only that we could go a couple hours on this topic, and maybe we will revisit it in the future. And if we get comments, that might help direct the specifics. I know Chris will join us anytime we want because he loves to talk about these topics as we do.
All right. Well, fantastic. So, Chris, thank you again. For those of you who have found what Chris had to say very interesting, suggest going and giving the podcast Cybersecurity Awesomeness a listen. The episodes are topical, they're fairly short, and as I listen to them, there's always something that I take away from it. And in general, if you're interested in what Dan and I are doing here, you can send us feedback and questions via the EAE podcast at emausa.com email address. You can reach out to both of us on LinkedIn and to go and subscribe. Look at Spotify, look at Apple Podcasts, look at all the podcast syndicators out there, and just ask for Enterprise Automation Excellence. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dan and Tom, for your insights on today's topic, and thanks to our listeners for joining the Enterprise Automation Excellence podcast. If you're a technology or operations leader looking to enhance your automation strategy, stay connected for more expert insights. Visit enterprisemanagement.com to learn how EMA can support your automation initiatives and check out more episodes for in-depth discussions and industry trends.